my gosh, today is a very excellent day because it is a weird day. Let me tell you, coral, it's strange, it's confusing, it's so interesting. There's a lot. So, welcome to Animal Chat Time, Coral Edition. We have the lovely Dana here, either on this side or that side, or up here or down there. I don't know. And it's me, Nora. So hello, my little Fanimals. We are talking about coral. Coral is super interesting because it looks like a plant. It grows in the sea. It is a carnivore, and it is made up of a whole bunch of different polyps. What's a polyp? I'm gonna tell you all about it. Let's get into it because I will not lie to any of you. When I was researching coral, the entire time I was like, what? What? And I needed to go deeper and deeper and deeper into different rabbit holes or kingfisher holes or marmot holes, whatever they are, to like really understand what this animal is. And just like every animal on earth, if we look out at like a macro, a really big level, all animals are like kind of weird because they grow perfectly where they're supposed to be. Coral is the same way. So coral is a carnivore. It eats meat. Okay. It's a polyp-based life form. I'm going to explain what that means. It's an invertebrate, so it doesn't have a skeleton like we do, and it lives in salt water. There are 600 different types of coral. So we're going to talk a little bit more about two types. We're going to talk about coral, then we're going to talk about two types of coral, and then I'm going to show you some pictures, and it's going to, like, everyone's brain is going to just like melt because these are all animals. So coral is a class of colonial animals that's related to hydroids, jellyfish, and sea anemones. I'm not good at saying that word, so I had to write it out in a way that I can remember it. Anemones. It's okay. So there are two types of coral. There is stony coral or hard coral, and then there's soft coral. I'm going to talk about both of those. Stony coral is a type of coral that's characterized by a hard skeleton. It looks like a stone. So some coral looks like a plant, some coral looks like a rock. They're all animals. Sure. So what stony coral does is the hard skeleton is it attaches itself to the bedrock of the coral reef, and it makes a reef. Stony coral colonies are composed of hundreds of thousands of individual living polyps. The polyps are capable of drawing dissolved calcium from seawater and solidifying into a hard mineral that is a structure that serves as skeletal support. So when you see a coral colony, the thin layer on the surface is live coral, and underneath that is the skeletons that's sometimes decades old. Okay, so what on earth is a polyp, right? What am I talking about? A polyp is basically, if like my hand is a polyp, what happens is a very, very, very tiny little microscopic seed, but it's actually a tiny little baby coral. It goes onto the substrate or the bedrock on the bottom of the ocean, and it plants itself. And then that little thing grows up into a polyp. And a polyp it looks kind of like a seed, kind of like my hand. And then it at the top, this is how it all the tentacles kind of live. And so when we look at pictures of coral, this is going to make a lot more sense. But in order for us to understand what coral is, it is a whole bunch of tiny, tiny little hands that the bottom is connected to the sea floor, and then these little hands are at the very top. Now, stony coral, all of the bottom of this hand looks like a rock, and inside it is calcium. It is like a hard rock, and it's only the top bit that is the tentacle area. So if you think about like a jellyfish, which is connected to coral, take a jellyfish, it's ooey gooey, it's moving, it's doing all these things, but then put a rock in the middle of the jellyfish, and then take that rock and connect it to a whole bunch of other jellyfish, like thousands of jellyfish. That's what coral is, but it's way smaller. So it's just a whole bunch of these little organisms that have different tentacles, and the hard ones have like a hard body that's connecting them to everything. So when you look at the coral colony, the thin layer on the very top is alive, and that is an animal, and the rest of it is just like skeleton of animal. The slow growth of these polyps and the expansion of time means that there's a permanent coral reef. So a whole bunch of coral together is called a colony, but then a whole bunch of coral colonies is a whole reef. So we think of the Belizean Great Barrier Reef, or we think of the Australian Great Barrier Reef. This is a whole bunch of animals, like millions, trillions probably, of animals that are all these little polyps that are all connected to each other, and those corals are connected to other corals connected to other corals. So it's kind of like if you are in an airplane and you're flying over a forest, it just looks like a big old forest, and then if you look down, every single forest is made of a lot of different trees. And all of those trees have a bunch of things going on inside of them. That is like a coral reef. So here is another thing that is going to make your brain go, wait, what? The polyps, the animals that make up coral reef, generally don't have color. What? So it is not like a kingfisher. It is not a trick of light and things like that. What gives them color is an organism that's on top of the polyps. So are you ready for it? I'm not. They are called zooxanthia. Zooxanthia. If you look it up, it is Zooxanthea, zoonanthia. Obviously, who couldn't pronounce that without helping themselves a little bit? So these are tiny microscopic algae, zoonanthia. So they live in a symbiotic relationship, which means they live together and they help each other out. They are friends, they're always on each other. The coral polyps, the little animals, they provide the algae a home. So the algae is a plant, the coral is an animal. So in exchange for a home, a place for the algae to live all around the polyps, the algae provides the polyps with food that they generate through photosynthesis. There's like a lot of words happening, friends, a lot of ways that I can get tripped up. Because photosynthesis requires sunlight, most reef-building corals live in clear, shallow water that can be penetrated by sunlight. This isn't always the case, don't worry, we're gonna talk about like other weird coral. But this is, the algae is actually the color that gives the coral the color. Coral polyps are actually normally transparent. They don't have any color at all. They just like hang out like this. And then the algae goes on top and all through them. And that's where they get their color from. This like beautiful, like bright algae. Amazing, right? So coral reefs also, we may or may not know, are very interesting because they have this symbiotic relationship with this like little tiny algae, but they also provide a habitat for like a huge amount of marine life. Sponges, oysters, clams, crabs, sea stars, sea urchins, loads of fish, like a bazillion different type of fish. Coral reef are also ecologically linked to seagrass, mangrove, that's a type of tree, mudflat communities. The reasons that coral reef are so highly valued is because they're at the center of kind of everything. The reason that the sea floor doesn't erode a whole bunch is because coral reef, there's like trillions of polyps that all have their structural support in the seabed, the reason that everything doesn't get washed away, the places that a lot of fish can eat and migrate and live and have babies and families is coral reef. They do all of these things. So there's 3 different kind of umbrellas of coral reef. There are hydrocorals, which are fire corals. These names do not make sense. They're reef building hydroids that have a hard exoskeleton, and they have stinging cells that will have a burning sensation when touched. And so those are kind of like anemones that are not coral. They're different animals, but you'll see them kind of swaying around, and they have these little stingers that some fish can go and hide in, like clownfish, Nemo, and they don't get stung, but other bigger fish could get stung. So they have another relationship. There's octocorals, which are soft corals. They include sea fans that just look like plants, but are still animals. If it looks like a rock, it's an animal. If it looks like a plant, it's an animal. They're all animals. There's also sea whips. They glow kind of like fleshy plant-like structures, and they don't form the calcium skeletons that the other hard ones do. And then there's Antipatharians, are black coral, and it's another type of soft kind of branching coral. I'm going to show you pictures of all of them because what? So a coral group is a colony, and then a lot of colonies is a reef. Now, each polyp is genetically identical. So that's really interesting. So we know that each polyp, a sac-like animal that's only a few millimeters, so even smaller than a centimeter, in length and then also in height, they have little tentacles around their mouth. But then around the other parts of them, once they latch on to another polyp or the sea floor or the different part of the reef, they start to excrete an exoskeleton. So they are breathing in the sea water that is full of salt, it's full of calcium, it's full of minerals, and they are excreting out calcium. So they're making themselves into a rock, essentially, which is kind of cool. So it's an exoskeleton at their base. So their base can be on the sea floor, and their tentacles can find food, find each other, do their things, but on the sea floor, and then the whole structure, all of that is exoskeleton rock almost. Over many generations, the colony and the skeleton for each characteristic of the species grows. So each species of coral grows in a different way. So there's elkhorn coral, and there's brain coral, and there is fan coral, and each of them know that the way that they grow looks a little different because that's their species. Just like any other animal grows in this specific way. Corals breed by spawning, kind of like fish. What they do, generally, this is interesting. Oh, the rest of it was not interesting. This finally is. Over the full moon, generally coral, what they'll do is they're on the floor, they're doing their thing, and spawning is just releasing eggs. So they will release eggs, and it will go into the sea, and then some of those polyps will go away, hang out somewhere else. Oh, wow, Tula, that looks so good. So many colors. And so some of the eggs will just go off somewhere, but other ones will just stick to that polyp and stick to another polyp and stick to another polyp. And that's why they're genetically identical, because they are the same one growing, looking like coral, the coral that we see. they have these tentacles, remember. They use these tentacles to catch plankton, so tiny, tiny, tiny fish, but then also sometimes small fish. They're very small, but they still, again, are carnivores, which is so interesting. Corals attain the majority of their energy from photosynthesis from the algae that's on top of them. So the algae is making all this energy and they're able to absorb that. That's where most of their energy comes from, but the rest of it comes from catching little plankton, little fish, things like that, which is, whoa. So these animals are, we call them carnivores, but like when I eat plants, I also get energy from photosynthesis. So like it's different, but kind of the same. So they're catching these like tiny little zooplankton. What they do when they are catching everything, they do it at night. The coral polyps open up, their tentacles come out, and they stretch out these long, long tentacles, and they pull the prey into their mouths, and they eat in their little skeletal structure. What? Super cool. Because of really strict environmental restrictions, they have to grow in seawater because they need to have all of the salt and calcium and all the minerals that come from seawater. Most coral can't grow in temperatures below 64 Fahrenheit, which is 18 degrees Celsius. But don't worry, I'm going to tell you about cold water reef because they are strange and cool. So cold water coral can actually be found in British waters. And so our Irish and British friends who will watch this later will go like, wait, what? There's actually coral reef that's growing in the Inner Hebrides in the water around that. So that's actually north of like Edinburgh. It's like right up there. It's very cold and they grow at 200 to 400 meters in depths. So remember when I said that like coral needed to have this algae to do photosynthesis? Throw that away. That is not true anymore. Most of the time they do in barrier reefs in the tropics where they're really, really colorful. That's when we need them. But then if they're growing very, very deep, no, we do not need to have photosynthesis happening here. The coral reef that is up in around the area in Scotland covers about 100 square kilometers and is about 4,000 years old. Right? Now, if you think about coral reef being tiny, tiny little polyps, they start little millimeter, little tiny little guys, and then you see a coral reef and you see coral and you even see just one big fan coral. It's going to take a long time to grow, right? So if you see something that is 100 square kilometers, it must take a really long time to grow in somewhere that is so cold, 4,000 years. It's kind of a forever time. So the coral reefs up in Scotland are, they are known as like an oasis of food and shelter. They're on the seabed. Lots of animals live in there. They seek out refuge. Little fish will go in between this coral to get away from big fish. And they, oh yes, so little fish like redfish, so cute, will find sanctuary away from Atlantic wolffish, just like little Red Riding fish and wolffish coming after them. But they also use it not only for refuge, also for a nursery ground. Now, this coral reef, how does this grow then if it doesn't have any algae helping it out? Well, it needs to have, like all coral, needs to have a hard surface to settle on. Old reef material is sometimes used on that. Sometimes it's rocks. Sometimes they grow off of shipwrecks, which is also kind of cool. They also form on hard glacial deposits and plow marks. And so that's so cool, right? When there was a time that like this area of Scotland and the sea around it was just pure snow and ice, and it plowed through, and that's where this coral grows, which is pretty neat. Now, they don't have to have the algae on them, and so they don't have any color to them, and they don't do any photosynthesis. The algae on top of them doesn't. So they just, their whole time, they're just eating zooplankton. So coral can live between 2 years and 100 years. The polyps can grow 5 years into several centuries. So one little polyp, sometimes 5 years, sometimes hundreds of years, but they grow and grow and grow and grow. Let's talk about their colors while I show you what they look like, because it's so interesting. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to take this over. Okay, coral. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a polyp. So it's this like little guy, lots of little hands, there's tentacles. These tentacles go out and about. They find zooplankton and sometimes teeny tiny little fish. They grab it and they bring it back inside. So they bring it into the stomach right in here. This is a lovely illustration by a woman named Emily M. Eng, and I love her because without this illustration, I had no idea what I was talking about. So this is coral, which is so beautiful. So this coral looks like a plant, and that is an animal. And this coral looks like a rock, and that is an animal. Now you can see all of these little tiny fans or little tiny hands or tentacles. Those are the polyps. And so the polyps are just these individual little guys on here, anything that looks like a little hand is a little polyp. That polyp grows, another polyp grows, another polyp grows, and it creates that structure. So each animal, each coral animal is an individual little polyp, and each polyp makes up a coral colony, and that colony looks like this. So it can sometimes look like stag horns or deer horns or other types of horns, but this is a colony, and you can see each little polyp on it is an individual animal, and then it's a colony, and that colony is in a reef, which is pretty neat. So here's like a brain coral. So they grow looking like a brain, but then this other coral, remember there's 600 different types. This other one looks sort of like a kind of cool antler situation. And that one, the polyps just grow like antlers. Their structure does. And then this is fan coral. So this is a soft coral. This looks like a plant, but this is also a animal. And so it looks a little bit different because it doesn't have like an individual polyp. Well, they all have individual polyps. It doesn't look like it does on the hard true coral, but each little guy here is a small animal that's a genetic match to its friend. And so all of them are of the same species, and they just know to grow this way. It's in their DNA. We're going to grow like a fan, obviously. So, you can look like a rock, you can look like a fan. You're still coral. You're still an animal. So that is the beauty and the wonder and the loveliness that is coral. I should say, people might ask about coral bleaching. That's very interesting. What happens with coral bleaching is, remember, the zooxanthia, the algae, that is the plant that's on top of the coral that gives it that lovely color. If it gets too warm, if the coral gets too warm, then the coral, what happens is they kind of, they have like a shock response, and they go like, I am uncomfortable. And if they're uncomfortable, then they tell the algae on them to go. So the algae actually removes itself from the coral, and the coral, remember, it gets most of its energy from the algae. That's how it kind of eats most of, that's how it gets its energy. So it tells the algae to go away. I'm too warm. I am sick. You do not need to be here anymore. And then the coral is bleached because the coral goes back to the color that coral actually is. But if it's that color, then it's not getting any energy or any food from the algae on top of it, and it will die. And so that's why the temperature of the oceans is really important, because it just makes the coral happier. If it's happier, it's cool to have its friends around. It wants to have algae, wants to have all those things. So coral bleaching doesn't actually bleach coral. It just takes the algae away from the coral, which is kind of interesting. But without them working together, they can't live. So we do need to not stress out coral, and make them evict their friends, essentially. So that is coral. Who has any questions about this weird plant rock carnivore?
I was wondering if coral is endangered.
Yeah, that is a great question. So yes, so there's 600 different types of coral. Almost all of them are endangered, but what we're seeing more is the reef is endangered, because there's tons of like little polyps that are everywhere, and maybe like trillions of polyps. But if there are trillions of them, but they're not attached to anything, then it's not, oh, Tula, that looks excellent. If it's not attached to a larger colony or a larger reef, then it is very much endangered, and it's not healthy for where it lives. So unfortunately, yes, all coral is endangered because all reefs are endangered, essentially.
I was also wondering if any coral is dangerous to humans.
Oh, if you stepped on coral, if it was a stony coral, it would hurt because it's stony, and that would hurt. But remember, a bunch of coral have, like anemone, have like little stingy vibration, or not vibrations. They have stinging cells around them. And so that can hurt other fish, and that can also hurt people. Not in a way that you would die, not in a way that like your arm would come off, but in a way that you go like, ooh, I don't like that, because they are very similar to jellyfish. So the jellyfish sting is sometimes like a coral sting. Mara has a question: is coral a keystone species? So it's a good question. Yeah. So a keystone species is a species that if something, it's an important species, and then if something goes wrong with it, then it's not great for the rest of the ecosystem. And then also it is an indicator species that if something goes wrong with it, we can say, ooh, something's wrong with everything. So coral is super, super, super important because it is a nursery for fish. It is a refuge for fish. It also, there's photosynthesis that's happening. And so there's like quite a lot of like interesting interactions between animals and plants and everything in that area. It also, having coral in an area doesn't provide, or in the sea, doesn't just provide a home for animals. It also means that there is less erosion of the seabed. And so if there's a tsunami or a hurricane or things like that, it acts as a barrier. And so those are really important. So like mangrove trees are great. If you have mangrove trees and a coral barrier between the shore and the water, then the animals on shore, including people, are going to be much safer after, say, a hurricane or things like that. So not only do they protect little fish that are like living around their little polyps, they also create like barriers, and they create these really big reefs that support life directly where they are, but then around the shore, and then in deeper areas as well. I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but I think that we probably have time for one more question. But Tula, yeah.
Do they grow?
Do they grow? Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, that's actually a very, a very good question, because this was something that I was very confused about. So polyps grow, but not infinitely, but coral colonies grow. So when little baby polyps go, they're like little seeds, they're floating through the sea. When they attach to something, they grow from a small seed to a polyp. And then that polyp, depending on the type of coral, can either be like the size of my thumb or the size of two thumbs, the size of half a thumb. That's kind of like the size that they are, thumb-ish size. So they don't grow bigger than that. But if you get a lot of polyps, tons of them, tons of them, then you will get a larger coral colony. So if you think of like brain coral, you could have 200 polyps that are the size of my thumb, and you'd have a little brain. But if you have 5,000 polyps the size of my thumb, then you would have a huge brain coral. So the polyps don't grow, but the colonies and how big the colony grows does grow. So the individual animal grows up, takes about 2 years, and then it just like hangs out full sized, and then it hangs out with its family in a colony. Oh, wow, Field, that is awesome. So many different colors. And this is the amazing thing about coral, right? Like tons of colors all over. And these colors are specifically, oh, Birch, that looks great. And these colors are not even from the coral. All of this color is from the algae, which is so weird and so cool. So interesting. Like, you know, every time we learn about an animal being a certain color, we learn that it's not actually that color. So our last question is from Mara, and other than humans, do they have any predators? Yes. There are some very natural predators of coral. There is something called a parrotfish, and they like to eat the polyps. They're very interesting. They're called parrotfish because they have like beaks, it looks like, and their beak is specially made to cut through their exoskeleton, their the calcium bit that, oh, looks so good. The calcium bit that is attached to the rest of the coral. So they bite off the calcium bit, and then they're able to yum, 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 the fleshy tentacle bit of the coral. In a perfect world, parrotfish, it would totally be fine. It's a circle of life. They eat a little bit of coral, coral eat a little bit of baby parrotfish. It's all these things. However, in a world that we're in right now, that you know, sea temperatures are going up, there are oil spills and things like that, the predators of the coral, people sometimes don't really like them to be around because they're the ones that are getting rid of all the coral. They are not. Everything works in a great circle of life. It is us that are like really bleaching coral and not doing great things. So there are parrotfish, there's other things that eat coral, but they can't destroy a whole coral reef or even like a coral colony as fast as temperature could. So on that kind of not great note, we are going to have a small coral dance. Now remember, oh yeah, Mara, you got it. We're all going to just pretend that we're polyps, and we just have little tentacles, and we are just like cute, and we're swinging, and we're getting little zooplankton, and we're doing it. Yeah, little coral, looking excellent, wonderful. And so like really, we're like 3 corals. This is one tentacle, this is one tentacle, and my face is also some more tentacles. 3 polyps doing it. Thanks everybody. That is Coral, a carnivore that looks like a plant, but also looks like a rock, but is an animal that lives in the tropical waters of the earth, but also the very cold waters of also Earth. I hope that everyone enjoyed it and you learned a lot. Next week, we are going to talk about moths. Yeah, the kind of slinky, cool, not so well known cousin of the butterfly. Moth friends. It'll be a very different dance than this. So thanks everyone. Yeah, we went over time again because how could we not? But I hope you have an excellent weekend, wonderful time. All do our dances, and I will see everyone next time. Bye.